Welcome back. We have another couple of concepts that are going to be valuable in thinking about corporate strategy. Some of those are opportunity costs and non-scale-free resources. So a lot of this research goes back to Edith Penrose, who was very important early in the foundations of the corporate strategy area of research. Edith Penrose proposed that diversification happens in part because firms have excess resources and those resources are indivisible. So for example, if you have a manufacturing facility and you're only using half of the capacity of that facility, you have some excess resource there and you can choose to start building some second product using that resource. Because you can't sell off half of a factory, that would justify diversification into a related business. Dan Levinthal and Wu have written a paper about this, and they've argued that this idea of excess resources implies that resources have an opportunity cost and that there's some fixed quantity. So if you think about that hypothetical manufacturing facility, by choosing to take the extra capacity and start building some new product, there is an opportunity cost of that. So for example, rather than building a second product, you could try to increase manufacturing of your first product and use the entire manufacturing capacity for that. So essentially trying to increase your market share and sell your primary product more broadly, versus having two different products, each using half of the manufacturing capacity and having that type of diversification. So this concept relates to whether or not resources are scale-free. If they are not scale-free, that means they have an opportunity cost and the resource must be allocated. So you can think about allocation as kind of a key word there. If some resource needs to be allocated, that means that it has an opportunity cost, and it can either be allocated for one purpose or some other purpose, and the relative return to both of those determines which makes the most sense for the firm. Brian and Dan also introduced another concept in this research, which is fungibility. So fungibility means that the resource is essentially more broadly useful. The dictionary definition of fungibility means interchangeable, and if you have some resource that's easily interchangeable, that tends to mean that it can be used broadly. So you can think about something like electricity. Electricity is very fungible. You don't really care if you're getting a watt from one type of power source or from another, if your goal is to get 1 watt of power. So that would be a very fungible resource. This is an example of a resource that also needs to be allocated, assuming you have some fixed capacity for electricity generation. You need to choose what you want to use that generation for. Of course, if there's an external market for electricity, you can buy as much as you need. But as you need to use more and more electricity, there may still be some incremental cost for that. So for example, the electrical system in your building may only be able to handle a certain amount of energy being brought into the building and distributed within the building, and that essentially limits the amount of total power you can access, and that requires the allocation of that power within the building. So resources can be highly fungible, or they can have very low fungibility. They can also be non-scale-free or scale-free. So scale-free resources are things that do not need to be allocated. So that could be something like a relationship or a brand name. And something that's non-scale-free could be like specific people, or if you only have a particular type of machine that can make multiple different products, say it's a 3D printer, that is non-scale free. You need to allocate that machine to producing whatever it is that you choose to produce. So resources that have high fungibility but that are not scale free can include things like solar panels on the top of the building. It only creates a certain amount of electricity, but that electricity can be used for nearly anything. Another example of a non-scale free but highly fungible resource is an experienced manager. So managing teams of many different types requires a lot of skills that tend to be similar across teams. So having a manager that's skilled and particularly one that's been embedded in your corporate culture for a while, they're able to take over a new team and kind of integrate that team into the rest of the business, or they can be left with their old team and continue to manage that well. So that's a resource that needs to be allocated. A non-scale free resource with low fungibility might be personnel with very specific technical expertise. Having that low fungibility doesn't mean they're not valuable. If you think about somebody like an engineer that designs microprocessors, there are very few people with that type of skill. And if you think about the next best use of their time besides designing microprocessors, it might be something worth substantially less. Of course, they could sweep floors if you needed somebody to do that, but that would be a much worse use of that resource. Taking low fungibility but scale-free resources, you can think about something like a customer relationship or a very narrow brand name. If you think about Roundup Weed Killer, that's a brand that's not very broadly useful. You don't want to have your breakfast cereal labeled as Roundup, or you don't want to buy clothes that are labeled as Roundup. So it's not a very fungible brand, but it is scale-free. So if you are able to find related products that are well suited to that brand name, there's no marginal cost to slapping that brand name on additional products. Taking that scale-free resource but with high fungibility, you can think of a much broader brand name. So for example, the Kirkland Signature brand from Costco, you can get Kirkland Signature mattresses, you can get Kirkland Signature dog food, you can get Kirkland Signature human food. There are clothes with the Kirkland Signature label in them. So that's a very broadly useful brand. It's highly fungible, and it's also, again, a scale-free resource as a brand. So there's no opportunity cost of putting that brand on an additional product. You can also think of something like a managerial philosophy as scale-free and highly fungible. So if an organization has a culture and a way of managing that works particularly well, they can often apply that managerial philosophy to multiple business units. There's no opportunity cost in applying that philosophy to additional business units. It's highly fungible. The challenge is that in order to apply it, you usually need some experienced managers from within the company, especially if it's a way of managing that's unique to the company. And the experienced managers, as mentioned previously, are not scale-free, so they need to be allocated. I think it's easy to confuse the idea of scale-free and highly fungible. So there's a lot of brands out there that are scale-free, as brands are, but that does not necessarily mean that they create value if applied to a broad range of products. One example of that that I've seen tweeted is from J.P. Eggers, great professor at NYU. He talked about Campbell's and how they tried to launch a fresh line or a new line of fresh vegetables, and they thought some of their existing brands would be useful for selling fresh vegetables, but they did not have success with that. And the argument from JP was that customers were not interested in buying fresh vegetables from a canned soup company. So that brand, again, was scale-free, but it was not fungible when applied to fresh produce. So that sums up those concepts. Again, a resource may be more or less scale-free. If it's not scale-free, that means there's an opportunity cost in applying it. A resource can also be more or less fungible. If it's highly fungible. It can be applied for many different uses without a sharp drop-off in value. If it is not very fungible, then it may still be very valuable for a particular situation, but is not necessarily highly valuable when applied to other situations.